Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 8th and tonight's movie is Pearl. Yesterday I saw X and today I'm going to see its companion movie. These movies both got released in the same year. I assume they were filmed at around the same time. This movie is a prequel to X. It shows us the backstory, the history, the lore of Pearl, the murderous old lady, by going back in time to when she was young and pretty, just like Maxine, because they are the same actress. Pearl told Maxine in X that she used to be a lot like her, and I'm sure Maxine didn't want to hear that. But just from the trailer, I can see where she was coming from. They both had that fame hunger to them, the I want to be loved by as many people as possible type of mentality. And we learned at the end of X that Maxine's father is a televangelist, a devout conservative Christian. And considering the fact that in this movie, Pearl is stuck on the same farm, taking care of her sick parents or something, and she feels trapped by that, maybe this is a look into what would have been if Maxine hadn't left the environment that she was raised in, because they established at the end of X that she also left that area and the dad doesn't even know where she is. But if your response to being in a constrictive upbringing is to murder people, I feel like that's more of a you problem. Maybe we'll see some comparisons and contrasting between how Pearl turned out in this movie with how Maxine's going to turn out in the next movie, because that's a sequel to X. It's a very interesting idea. I'm going to go give it a watch. Finally, we are cooking. I loved Pearl. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Favorite movie of the month so far. I also feel like I made a lot of unfounded assumptions going into this because it was not really what I was expecting. I thought this was going to be a somewhat sympathetic backstory about how life can turn a normal young woman into a murderer, but not really. Pearl was always just kind of a bad egg. One of the first things you see her do in the movie is kill a goose with a pitchfork, just because, and then feed the dead body to the alligator in the pond. There was an alligator in the pond in X, and I was kind of wondering why it just would walk up and eat any person that came in. That's probably why. She has been feeding people to that alligator for years. But anyway, I thought that Mia Goth did really good in X, but her performance in Pearl is honestly among the best I've seen in a horror movie. I fully understand what the hype about Mia Goth as an actor is now. There is a scene in this movie where she starts spilling her guts, basically, saying all the quiet parts out loud for the first time in her life. And there was a point when I realized, oh my gosh, this shot is still on her face. So she memorized this entire essay and was able to act flawlessly the whole time. And it went on and on and on. And at the end of it, the shot was 6 minutes. At that point, she's just showing off. And the last shot of this movie was kind of brilliant in the way that it sort of encapsulated the entire experience, because it was a shot of her after doing a bunch of terrible things and she's trying to put on this big happy smile, but you can tell she's forcing it and you think the movie's going to end, but then it just holds on that shot and she's still trying to force the smile and it keeps slipping and she keeps twitching and it starts out being funny and then it just gets more and more awkward and uncomfortable, and it's a minute long. This movie is a back and forth between being horrified of this character and feeling sympathy towards this character, because Pearl was never an innocent soul that got corrupted by the world around her. The world around her didn't help matters, but at best it just sort of sped things up a little. And I know how odd it is to say this, but it really feels like X just seemed like a lighthearted, simple take on a slasher movie, but this movie gets a lot darker, psychologically. And it is a fascinating psychological study of someone who is legitimately unwell. There really isn't much I want to talk about this movie without going into spoilers, so I'm just going to say, if you thought that Pearl was an interesting character in X and you were wondering what happens to a person where this is who they end up as, this movie will give you that and so much more. There are some things about it I didn't care for, some things that didn't add up, but for the most part, this is a very well written, well directed, and especially well acted movie. I enjoyed it a lot. All right, now I want to talk about some spoilers. Obviously, Mia Goth deserves all the praise for her performance in this movie as Pearl, but I also want to draw some attention to Tandy Wright, who plays Pearl's mother. There is a scene right at about halfway through this movie that is like the dinner scene from Hereditary, except with two people firing on all cylinders instead of just one. We as the audience knew that there was something off about Pearl from the beginning, but we didn't know her mother knew that. And she reveals that and says basically that she's afraid of her and wants to protect the world from her. It devolves into a physical fight between the two of them. And it ends up with the mom accidentally getting her dress caught on fire because they got too close to the fireplace and her whole body going up in flames. And then Pearl, legitimately panicked, grabbing a giant pot of soup off the stove and throwing that on her body. And it takes out the fire, but I'm sure that the mother doesn't feel so great about it. Now, that was something that all happened fast. That was an accident. But what happens next is a choice where she grabs her mother's body, drags her down to that same cellar that Lorraine would get locked in X, and just leaves her down there. And mind you, the dad, who had been in like a catatonic state in a wheelchair for this entire movie, saw the whole thing. And this man never says a single word, but you can tell in his facial expressions that he is horrified. So then she kind of has to cover her tracks a little bit because, there are other people who know them. And the husband of Pearl in X is named Howard. And this is actually the same Howard, but he's off fighting in World War One for almost the entire movie. But obviously, their families are friends with each other. And another character in this movie is her friend Mitzi, a sister in law. And one moment that even at the time I thought, wait, that's kind of confusing is the family of Howard brings them like a roast pig and like puts it down on the doorstep. But then like this is like a day and a half later when Pearl brings her prospective love interest back to the farm and he sees that the roast pig is still there on the doorstep now getting eaten by maggots and I'm like, wait, what? Because the mom would have had to have been the one who left that there for hours. At this point, Pearl tries to bring him up to her room so they can get all frisky, but then there are these weird noises, and it just kind of devolves into him putting together that something is deeply wrong here. She keeps lying about things, and he wants to leave, and then she puts together that he's suspicious of something. And he is about to drive away when she comes up with the pitchfork and uses the pitchfork. But then we get to this audition that they've been building up to throughout the entire movie. Like, Pearl sees this as a chance for her to leave this town forever, to finally leave this farm life behind. And she does the audition. And considering how much they built this up, I was thinking, like, I can't even imagine what she's going to do if this happens and she gets a no. And then it happens. She tries her best and she gets a no. And again, it exceeded my wildest expectations. If you want to watch this scene, I'd recommend it. I'd recommend watching the movie more. But if you want to watch one scene from Pearl, this is probably it. So after that spectacular mental breakdown, Mitzi helps walk her home, and the pig is still there on the front porch getting eaten by maggots, except it's a lot worse. And this is where we get that scene of her trauma dumping to Mitzi, saying all these things, all these dark thoughts in her mind for the first time out loud. And again, it's an amazing scene. And we sort of get the same thing we got with that man earlier, where Mitzi really just wants to leave. She's confused, she's afraid, and she just doesn't want to be there anymore. But she also wants to appease Pearl. And when she's finally able to leave this house, we get a long extended shot of her walking away, and then we see Pearl walk out the front door. And then we see Pearl grab an axe, and then I was like, oh no. And we see in real time Pearl chase her down and kill her with the axe. And at that point, I guess she decided I'm in too deep. I'm just going to have to cover this all up. And she does. And the last part of the movie is Howard finally coming back from the war and seeing the dead bodies of both Pearl's parents sitting at a table of rotting food. And then Pearl comes up and says, I'm so glad to have you back. And then that long smile shot happens. And Howard does look horrified, but considering the relationship they had formed by the time X comes along, I guess that they worked it out amongst themselves. And I thought that this was a great movie. This is a movie you could have seen all on its own and it would have stood up on its own. And it also really works as a prequel to X because Pearl was the most interesting character in that movie. I thought it was great, and Mia Goth's performance as Pearl, I do think, belongs in the upper echelon of acting performances I've seen for Horror Nights, right up there with Toni Collette in Hereditary or Brad Dourif in The Exorcist 3. Pretty good movie. I don't know how good Maxine's going to be because it doesn't have Pearl in it, but I guess I'm going to find out tomorrow.